Hi gang, in the history of the Imperium of Man, the Nova Terra Interregnum is a mysterious period of civil strife when the Imperium was split asunder by warring factions and religious crises. But unlike many other events in the history of Warhammer 40k, there are no actual books about it, no stories or novels set in it, and no explanation of why it happened. Only snippets spread here and there through the lore. So let's piece it all together and try and find out what the Nova Terra Interregnum and its immediate counterpart, the Moirae Schism, actually were. In Warhammer 40k, the Nova Terra Interregnum is a mysterious period of Imperial history that takes up almost all of the 35th millennium. A warring states period, it caused the Imperium to split into warring factions for the best part of 900 years, and the ripples of dissent that it caused set off numerous other rebellions and crises of faith, most notably the Mechanicus Civil War, known as the Moirae Schism. However, much of the detail of exactly what caused the interregnum and how it unfolded is lost to history. The whole event is retold as snippets of text without any clear single story or single source of lore. Like a lot of 40k, it's retold through glimpses in a whole slew of different publications, and a lot of seemingly important information is just missing. For example, the whole period is also known as the Time of Two Emperors, but absolutely nowhere is it recorded what or who the second emperor might have been. It's an interregnum, which usually means a period between the reign of two rulers, and one of them's definitely this big golden guy. We just don't know who the other one was. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a story to tell here. Over the last few decades, all of those little snippets and glimpses have piled up, and if we put them all together, we can begin to build a picture of what might have happened. So, for this video, I've done some biblioarchaeology of my own, gone through everything I could find that exists about the period, and attempted to make it make some sort of sense. What exactly started the Nova Terra Interregnum is lost to Imperial history, but its effects would spread across the galaxy, see a fifth of the Imperium declare independence, and contribute to such a destabilization that for 900 years, the Imperium was effectively split in two, leading to a cascading series of crises and rebellions. Nova Terra was a planet in the Segmentum Pacificus, the western reaches of the Imperium of Man. In the early 35th millennium, for reasons that I'm sure were well known at the time, the Council of Nova Terra dismissed the authority of the High Lords of Terra and claimed rule over the whole of the Segmentum Pacificus with considerable support from other systems within the Segmentum. This came at the end of a series of sweeping changes to the administration of the Imperium. The previous 2 millennia were known as the Reforging, a time when the chaos that followed the Horus Heresy and then the War of the Beast was finally put aside, and the Imperium of Man consolidated its power. Systems of astropathic relays were strengthened, trade routes formalized, communications and defense networks improved, and the reach of the High Lords spread out from Terra to reinforce Imperial rule across the galaxy. At the same time, the ecclesiarchy was massively growing in power. Officially legitimized during the 32nd millennium, the ecclesiarchy had continued to grow in influence, building its armies and maneuvering for power within the halls of Terra, all while imposing a rigid structure of cathedrals, churches, and tithes on the worlds of the Imperium, something that made the organization increasingly rich and powerful. By the dawning of the 35th millennium, the Imperium then was a very different place to the headless empire that had emerged from the end of the heresy. It was a unified state with a state religion and a spiderweb of powerful agencies and organizations that crisscrossed the galaxy, ensuring compliance. And so it might come as no surprise that the early 35th millennium was a time of rebellions and successions against that. For whatever reason, the Nova Terra Interregnum was the most prominent of these, and the rebellion of the Council kicked off centuries of low-grade civil war as planets in the region declared their support for the secessionists. Even the Adepta of Terra were split, with whole sections of many administratum departments continuing their work just under new masters. But this wave of localized rebellions does seem to have had agitators behind the scenes. The original instigator of the rebellion on Nova Terra was a figure known as the Saviour of Praxis, or the Robed Rogue, who rose to become a leader of that Council, and this attracted the attention of the Dark Angels chapter of Space Marines. The Dark Angels long suspected the involvement of the Fallen in this wave of rebellions, and they were convinced that this figure could be none other than Cypher, Lord of the Fallen, in disguise. The Fallen were those Dark Angels who had sided with Luther during the fall of Caliban, when the Dark Angels' homeworld shamefully turned away from the Imperium at the end of the heresy. Though the world had been destroyed in the aftermath, the traitor Dark Angels had been scattered through the warp, some emerging centuries or millennia later, and the Dark Angels had a vested interest in capturing them, lest their ancient betrayal become widely known to the rest of the Imperium. The Dark Angels fleet moved into the Segmentum Pacificus and, ranging ahead of the main fleet, their Raven Wing brought the fight directly to Nova Terra. In 245 of M35, the Raven Wing assaulted the planet, but they failed to apprehend Cypher or any other fallen angels. However, the attacks did uncover a number of clues that continued to occupy the chapter for the next 2 centuries. Rumours of the Fallen bore fruit on a number of rebellious worlds in the sector, and this eventually culminated in the Hrakon campaign of 495. After following a trail of clues, the chapter managed to track down Obadiah Hrakon, once a standard bearer in the Dark Angels Legion, now serving as the despot ruler of a rebellious planet. When the fallen angel took flight, the chapter pursued him through both the Segmentum Pacificus and the neighbouring Segmentum Tempestus as far as the Veiled region on the southern edge of the galaxy, where he was finally cornered on a piratical port world, apprehended by a mass teleport deployment of the Deathwing, and dragged back to the Rock for interrogation. While this was happening, though, throughout the Segmentum and the wider Imperium, more planets declared for Nova Terra. In the latter half of the Millennium, taking advantage of the chaos and confusion, the Tellarite Rebellion seized control of a number of systems to create their own pocket empire. In the resulting conflict, the Tellarites made use of locally produced land Leviathans that were armed with STC weapon systems, later recovered by the Imperium and utilised in the design of the Praetor armoured assault launcher. One of the more significant effects of the Nova Terra Interregnum was the crisis of faith that spread across the galaxy as the rule of terror diminished. And this not only led to waves of heretical cultist rebellions, but also spread into the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Moirae Schism was one of the more prominent results of this interregnum. In fact, more information remains about the schism than about the interregnum period that birthed it. The minor forge world of Moirae was home to a sect of tech magi that had been studying the Astronomicon, the giant psychic navigational beacon guided by the Emperor on Terra. Through centuries of study, they'd discovered minute fluctuations and patterns in the beacon, and a religious sect had grown up that sought to interpret these fluctuations as messages from the Omnissiah. By analysing these minute differences in energy output and utilising the results as a form of divination, the Omnissiah might grant them visions of the future. This sort of minor sect devoted to a particular aspect of study was nothing new in the vastness of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but in this time of uncertainty, the teachings of the Moirae sect spread like wildfire. And this was a problem because the messages the trio of tech mystics who led the Forge world were divining were apocalyptic. The calculations of Moirae predicted the overthrow of Mars and the inevitable merging of the faiths of Mars and Terra into one singular faith, a unification of the Adeptus Ministorum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. This was, of course, sedition and heresy to the authorities of Mars, and the Adeptus Mechanicus also erupted into civil war, with lines being drawn between traditionalists and radical Moiraeans across the galaxy. Forge worlds were split asunder, with Moiraeans declaring themselves in the ranks of the Skitarii and even in the Titan legions. Even Space Marine chapters with close ties to the Mechanicus found themselves facing dissension in their ranks as their tech marines declared for or against the teachings of Moirae. Hundreds of chapters were rendered almost unable to act due to ideological differences in the depths of their forges. In the Iron Hands chapter, always closely aligned with the Adeptus, this nearly led to civil war when 3 rival clan companies came to blows. The Moiraean Borgos clan attacked the holdings of the loyalist clan Dorvok and were only restrained by the intervention of clan Raucan. Fearing the hand of the Inquisition should part of the chapter turn renegade, the Moiraean elements of the chapter were exiled from their homeworld, Medusa, and forced to swear oaths never to raise their hands against their battle brothers again. These exiled Iron Hands would eventually be joined by Moiraeans from the other Iron Hand successors, and they continued to fight through the era until centuries later when they were reformed as the Sons of Medusa chapter. There's a whole video on that here. Moirae itself was one of the earliest casualties of the schism. The world was blasted to dust by a massive Adeptus Mechanicus retaliation fleet deployed from Mars, but the Moiraean creed continued to spread. In the Gulf of Black Shadows, mining wars between the rival Forge worlds turned into colossal fleet battles, turning the Gulf into a graveyard littered with the wreckage of Mechanicus arcs. By the end of the millennium, many surviving Moiraeans had turned to Techno-heresy to protect their dying creed. Moirae had been one of the main manufacturers of the whirlwind Hyperios, and Magi of that world started to embed failsafes that would shut down the weapon systems upon receiving a secret code, something that's tainted the reputation of the vehicle ever since, especially among those loyalist chapters who found their artillery pieces suddenly useless. And some Moiraeans went even further. The radical Zarizian sect indulged in the creation of technologies so malefic that even their fellow Moiraeans hunted them down. Their only surviving relic is now a pattern of laser destructor used by houses of traitor knights. And in the same period, things got so bad that a resurgence of the Dark Mechanicum had to be put down on the world of Gorasis by a strike force of the Adeptus Custodes. The end of this period was to come with the events surrounding the Cataclysm of Souls in 975 M35. The ecclesiarchy, ever eager to increase their own power, attempted to reform the fractured Imperium by essentially mounting a political coup, reorganizing the Imperium as a theocratic state, ostensibly to unite it across the political divide. Initially, this backfired. Their political machinations were thwarted, and the Council of Nova Terra and their allies across the Segmentum Pacificus outright rejected the ecclesiarchy's teachings. But that rejection resulted in a colossal war of faith prosecuted by the ecclesiarchy that ended up binding the many loyalist forces together and sweeping through the Segmentum Pacificus. Even the Dark Angels, still active in the area, returned to Nova Terra to do their part in overthrowing the rebels. Near the end of the millennium, billions died as the Crusade purged its way across the Segmentum, eventually overthrowing the Council and ending the Interregnum period with the Imperium united once more. However, the fires of Nova Terra had long-lasting effects in the following millennia. While the Moirae Schism was effectively ended with the destruction of Moirae, the creed itself lasted much longer. The conflict in the mining fields of the Gulf of Black Shadows went on for centuries, with maniples of robots constantly captured and reprogrammed to fight for both sides. Eventually, after another millennia of sporadic conflict and purges authorized by both Mars and the Inquisition, the beliefs of the tech mystics of Moirae were officially consigned to history. Though in the years since, it has been noticed that the single surviving copy of the beliefs of the Moirae sect, held under lock and key by the Inquisition, do seem to predict the formation of the Great Rift and the fall of Cadia, things that wouldn't happen for another 5 or 6 millennia, if you interpret them the right way. The Cataclysm of Souls and the ending of the Interregnum had a lot more immediate effect. The colossal war of faith that had finally ended the rebellion had left the ecclesiarchy in an extremely powerful political position, a position that would lead in the 36th millennium to another civil war, the Age of Apostasy and Goj Vandire's Reign of Blood. But that's definitely a story for another video. The Nova Terra Interregnum is a very 40k construction. I'm pretty sure its very first appearance as a passing note on this 40k timeline was added just because pretty much every empire has some sort of warring states period, and it felt sensible to fill in the timeline with one for 40k. Ancient China had an actual warring states period, as well as a number of periods where multiple dynasties claimed to be in charge. Ancient Rome had numerous actual interregnum periods, instances where there were multiple bits of the empire claiming to be under the authority of a different true emperor. And of course, it eventually split into a Western and Eastern empire. Sometimes these historical events are periods of like constant high-intensity warfare, but other times, just like this, they're relatively quiet periods of disunity where the claimants, unsure if any of them have the military strength to take control, just spend decades attempting to outmaneuver the others. In fact, it's such a common trope for empires that they even threw one into Warhammer Fantasy too. The Empire has a time of the three emperors when it was divided between different claimants. In fact, it's kind of when the new Old World game is set. So originally, I'm pretty sure this was just thrown in as another example of an imperial rebellion, of how large and unwieldy the Imperium of Man can be, and so that there was something on the timeline for those empty middle millennia. But once it was there, people then started to use this relative void in the lore to add character to other factions. The 6th and 7th edition Dark Angels books added all that stuff about the Fallen and Cypher potentially being behind it all. The Badab War campaign set the origins of a few of its chapters in that period and added the stuff about the Moirae Schism, and that was then retrospectively written in as a potential cause of the Age of Apostasy. So over time, without anyone really sitting down and defining it, it developed its own character as a period of politically motivated religious unrest, which means by now it's like the 40k equivalent of the Western Schism, a period in the late 14th century when, for various political reasons, there were rival popes in both France and Italy. And the other thing it really reminds me of is the English civil wars in the 17th century. This was actually a couple of discrete periods of warfare that overthrew the monarchy, resulting in an actual interregnum period. But it also happened at a time when everyone was fanatically religious by today's standards. So not only did the wars cause a massive amount of general social upheaval, but there was also the ominous threat at various points of Catholicism, or at one point Presbyterianism, being imposed on people's mortal souls, and the casting down of what the people of the time believed the holy position of the monarchy. And then that political uncertainty mixed up with the religious uncertainty led to all sorts of apocalyptic beliefs and doomsday predictions about the second coming or whatever. I think that's probably what was going through the minds of, I don't know, someone who was writing bits of this. But just like always with 40k, once that little idea existed, more little bits were added here and there in various codexes to give them a sense of history, and we end up with all this, an entire millennia-long event with a pretty traceable cause and effect, maybe, but actually created by a group of writers just adding little bits to it for 30 years, like a big collaborative writing exercise. And also, like everything in 40k, there's the odd joke thrown in. If you've already gone to the comments to complain that I'm not pronouncing it Moirae or Moirae, well, that's because I think the whole thing's named after the Moirae effect. Moirae patterns are a type of visual illusion created when you put two grids together and the conflicting weaves seem to generate these wibbly-wobbly patterns. They're why some TV shows try and avoid costumes that have tight checks or lines on them, because the sensor of the camera is also a grid and it might react in weird wibbly-wobbly ways. It's an optical illusion that isn't really there, caused by looking at too many overlapping patterns at the same time, which is quite a lot like the Texiers of Moirae. Of course, both of these events are very far from being fully fleshed out. This is everything I could find. There are other related events in the same millennia that you sometimes find thrown in on some of the wikis, the Pale Wasting and stuff like that, but a lot of those don't seem to happen in the same area or have anything to do with the rest of the period, so I haven't included them. It would be lovely at some point to get a novel or a little series set in the period, but for now, all we have is this. Enough material that if you stare carefully into the fluctuations and do all your calculations correctly, you can just about piece together a story. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like more videos on the history of 40k and its lore, there should be a little box popping up to the right there. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can like and subscribe like usual, or join the Patreon or YouTube memberships for early access to video, and at certain levels, access to our Discord. See ya.